So thank you to NAMMCO for inviting me, and thank you for the Nordic House teams. I'm Anatole Danto, French maritime anthropologist, and I will give a talk today dedicated to intangible cultural heritage, a new tool for sustainability with the case of marine mammal hunting in boreal coastal communities and some examples out of NAMMCO area. So what is intangible cultural heritage? ICH is a new heritage subcategory. It's a subcategory of cultural heritage, which also includes furniture, real estate, archaeology, artistic, and so on. It is distinguished by its non-physical character, not being any object. Because of this state, its definition remains sometimes vague and constitutes a form of porous border with other categories. Porous border, but also interesting border. So just a brief socio-history of intangible cultural heritage. So as I said, it's a recent category institutionalized in the late 90s. This notion comes from various work emanating at the same time from scientists, community, NGOs, and international institutions dedicated to heritage issues. This field emerges during work devoted on an international scale to popular cultures carried by communities, particularly indigenous ones. This category was formalized in 2003 through the adoption of a convention by UNESCO, the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. And the convention enters into force in 2006 with the signatures of the 30th state party. So just the two first articles. Article 1, the intangible cultural heritage means the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible cultural heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. And the second article, interesting too, the intangible cultural heritage as defined in the first article is manifested inter alia in the following domains: oral traditions and expressions, including language as a vehicle of the intangible cultural heritage, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, very interesting, and traditional craftsmanship. So as you can see, intangible cultural heritage is in the middle of the heritage galaxy between tangible and natural heritage. Yes, there is a mistake on the table, so it's not the second version of my PowerPoint, and it's intangible cultural heritage on the left and tangible on the right. Sorry. Once the convention has been ratified, it is transcribed into national law. A management authority is set up, so often the ministry in charge of culture. And for NAMMCO countries, all of the NAMMCO countries ratified that convention, so in 2005 for Iceland, 7 for Norway, 9 for Greenland, and 18 for Faroe Islands. There are two ways of protection throughout the convention. The first at the national level, so a community submits a request to the management authority for classification under the national inventory. And the second at a UNESCO, so a global level, a state supports a community approach to recognition with an application for inclusion in the international inventory. So national inventories are freely organized, but generally states organize them into categories that correspond, of course, more or less to the subcategories of the convention. Concerning the world inventory, there are three distinct lists. So the first dedicated to intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. For example, in 2022, the Borch of Ukraine has been classified. The second one is the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity, and the third one is the register of good safeguarding practices. Now, what's about intangible cultural heritage implications and applications on marine mammals hunting? So, just some words with the Canadian case. In Canada, there is an inventory of ethnological resources of intangible heritage in the Quebec province. So it's a non-regulatory inventory carried by a university as of 2003. And inside this inventory, there is an inventory dedicated to the seal hunt in the Magdalene Islands. Canada is a state not party to the 2003 convention, but freedom left to the relatively autonomous provinces on the subject. So also in Quebec, the province organizes a regional inventory. The cultural heritage repertory of Quebec, which includes different categories, and one of which is dedicated to intangible cultural heritage, with, for example, the inventory including the whaling's memory. Another example, it's the island of Kihnu in Estonia, so small island, 16 square kilometers, 600 inhabitants, and 8 kilometers from the mainland. In Estonia, Estonia ratified the convention in 2006, and the Kihnu cultural space inscribed in 2008 on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. It was one of the first inventory at the UNESCO level. So, as you can see, just 2 years after the beginning of the application of the convention. So, in Kihnu, traditional way of life connected to the sea, of course, with fishing, hunting, ancestral activities, and during Soviet time, because of the 5-year management plans for the fishing kolkhoz, a lot of seal hunting objectives each year. But in 1988, thanks to ELCOM convention, seal hunting ban in the Baltic for all countries and, of course, for Kihnu. Despite the ban, the practice has continued more or less secretly. So for a local community, it was a kind of perpetuation of the tradition. But for the state, of course, it was a poaching activity. So in 2003, a group of inhabitants got together and became interested in the UNESCO Convention. And they proposed the classification of the cultural space of the island and the surrounding territories, validated in 2008. This inscription recognizes and protects the traditional way of life of the inhabitants, and it has several components: dances, costumes, handicraft, food, but also hunting, sea fishing, environmental awareness, and islands. Thanks to this registration on the UNESCO list, the status of the community and its way of life has changed with respect to the Estonian state. And based on this classification, and of course the good state of the seal populations recognized by scientific authorities, the community fought to reauthorize legally the local seal hunt. This was the case in the early 2010s, about 5 years after the classification. So now, thanks to this classification, hunting has been recognized as part of the traditional way of life of Estonian Islands communities. A quota license declaration system has been put in place. At the same time, the classification requires the state and the community to answer the maintenance of this intangible heritage with a set of actions concerning both the ecosystem, logically, with the disappearance of the seals, the practice dies out, but also the socio-system, including in particular the transmission of practices to the future generations. So what's about intangible cultural heritage and sustainability? Now, the inscription of this way of life allows, moreover, to unroll the ball of the intangible cultural heritage, and the whole of the elements being in interrelations, of course, close or distant. So the UNESCO web platform dedicated to the convention now allows to query each classification under the World Inventory against the UN Sustainable Development Goals systems. So as you can see, I just put an example with Kishnu Island. And a cultural, also another thing interesting, so a cultural cooperation program dedicated to the intangible cultural heritage led by Finland has provided an operational framework for these interrelationships, whether from scientists, communities, or museum institutions. This resulted in the production of the wheel chart of sustainability and intangible cultural heritage. So you can find it on the internet website at the left. And it's very interesting, this chart, because it's very useful for local communities to manage their cultural space with this issue. Moreover, more and more institutions, platforms, or international arenas are now making the link between sustainability issues and cultural heritage issues, especially intangible ones. Just for examples, the working group on Article 8 of the Convention on Biological Diversity with dedicated guidelines for communities, the IPBES with work programs dedicated to knowledge in its plurality, and the WIPO on ecological knowledge, and of course several others. Thus, thanks to the intangible cultural heritage, hunting practices are becoming more acceptable in the eyes of some institutions and are even beginning to be protected and sometimes promoted. They are becoming an integral part of cultural rights, so a legal concept that is still globally ill-defined, but which is based on various international texts and mechanisms related to human rights, and some of them, this text has been quoted yesterday. But no inscription on national or UNESCO lists require political support. Just a brief example, in France, a recent example nuances this presentation. The waterfowl hunters of the Loire estuary wished to initiate a classification process for their traditional hunting practices with decoys in some estuarian wetlands, but the Ministry of Culture refused this classification, arguing that the patrimonialization of a hunting activity is contrary to animal ethics and does not currently enjoy a favorable regime within public opinion. So the classification consecrates the diversity of the relations between man and nature, but also the existence of multiple cosmologies throughout the world, which Western societies are not necessarily, even today, able to apprehend completely. The protection throughout this category of cultural heritage of hunting activities can thus be engaged for the benefit of northern coastal communities. The inherent classification also makes it possible to go beyond the sole practice of hunting, but to include it more broadly in a set of actions, uses, practices, rites, beliefs, and representations, which, taken together, form the identity of the communities. And just to finish, the Greenlandic example, just some word. So the work of a Greenland country with a national inventory managed by the Nunata Katersuga Sivia Alagaterharfialu, sorry for my very bad pronunciation, but with very interesting elements classified thanks to this inventory, knowledge of skin treatment, sharing meat, sorry I did a mistake, it's meat, M-E-A-T, of course, meat presents, first hunt celebration, and hunting grounds rights. Thank you.